October 7th, 1944, 28,000 feet above Aachen, Germany. Major George Preddy grips the control stick of his P-51D Mustang, call sign Cripes a Mighty Third, as his wingmen call out contacts. Through the crystal-clear autumn sky, he spots them two silver streaks moving at speeds that should be impossible. Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighters, Hitler's wonder weapons, capable of 540 miles per hour in level flight, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than any propeller-driven fighter in existence. Standard doctrine says engagement is futile. The jets are untouchable, too fast for conventional interception. American pilots have been briefed. Avoid direct pursuit, catch them during takeoff or landing when they're vulnerable, or don't engage at all. The speed differential is simply too great. A P-51D's maximum speed of 440 miles per hour means the Me-262 can close or disengage at will, dictating every aspect of the engagement. But on this October morning, something is different. Preddy's Mustang is running a special fuel mixture, something the mechanics at his base have been experimenting with for weeks. The engine note has changed a higher, sharper pitch that vibrates through the airframe. His manifold pressure gauge shows readings that would normally cause detonation and destroy the engine within minutes. Yet the Packard-built Merlin V16507 runs smooth as silk, pulling power that shouldn't be possible from a piston engine at this altitude. The Me-262 seconds are diving from 30,000 feet, targeting a formation of B-17 flying fortresses below. Their tactics are well-practiced dive through the bomber formation at maximum speed, fire a burst from their 430mm Mk-108 cannons, then use their speed advantage to climb away before American escorts can react. It's a technique that has proven devastatingly effective, and one that conventional piston fighters cannot counter. Preddy doesn't follow standard doctrine. He pushes his throttle through the war emergency power gate, advancing the control all the way forward to a position that activates water methanol injection. The mixture, stored in a 30-gallon tank behind the cockpit, floods into the engine's supercharger, cooling the compressed air charge and allowing even higher manifold pressures without detonation. But that's not the secret. The real innovation is in the fuel itself. His Mustang accelerates with an urgency that surprises even him. The airspeed indicator climbs past 450, past 460, reaching speeds that North American aviation's test pilots said were only possible in a steep dive. But he's in level flight, maintaining altitude, closing on the jets with a rate of closure that shouldn't exist. The Me-262 pilots, confident in their speed advantage, don't break off their attack run. They're focused on the bombers, unaware that the impossible is happening behind them. At 800 yards, Preddy opens fire. 6 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns send 80 rounds per second, streaking toward the lead. Me-262. The German pilot, finally aware of the threat, attempts to accelerate away. But he's already committed to his attack run, his speed relatively low for the jet, perhaps 400 miles per hour. Preddy's Mustang, somehow, impossibly, is matching that speed and gaining. Strikes appear on the Me-262's right engine nacelle. Pieces of aluminum skin tear away, fluttering in the slipstream. The jet begins trailing smoke, its acceleration dying as the damaged engine loses power. The pilot jinks left, trying to use his remaining engine to escape, but the damage is done. The Me-262 begins a descending turn, losing altitude, its speed advantage gone. Preddy follows, firing controlled bursts, until the jet pilot rolls inverted and bails out at 15,000 feet, his wonder weapon tumbling toward the German countryside below. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special. For you, the second Me-262 breaks off, firewall his throttles, and disappears into the distance with acceleration that even Preddy's modified Mustang cannot match. But the victory is revolutionary. A propeller-driven fighter has just engaged and destroyed a jet fighter in level flight combat at 28,000 feet, something that every combat analysis said was impossible. When Preddy lands at his base in Belgium, the intelligence officers crowd around. They've heard the radio calls, know what happened, but they need confirmation. Preddy's combat report is clinical and precise. Engaged Me-262 at 28,000 feet. Aircraft performance significantly enhanced. Able to maintain pursuit speeds in excess of normal maximum. Enemy aircraft destroyed after brief engagement. What he doesn't mention in the official report, what he tells his squadron mates over drinks that evening, is the gut feeling he had during the engagement. His Mustang wasn't just running well, it was running impossibly well. The engine was developing power that exceeded every specification, every test result, every engineering calculation. And it all came down to fuel. The story of how this became possible begins not in the engineering departments of North American Aviation or Packard Motor Company, but in the cramped workshop of a sergeant mechanic who was told his idea was stupid, dangerous, and would get pilots killed. His name was Technical Sergeant Anthony Spagnuolo, and his unauthorized experiments with fuel additives would change the air war over Europe in ways that official channels never could have achieved. Spagnuolo arrived at the 352nd Fighter Group's base in Bodney, England, in July 1944, part of a replacement crew rotation. The 9-year-old mechanic from Brooklyn had worked in his father's automotive repair shop before the war, developing an intuitive understanding of internal combustion engines that formal training often missed. He understood that engines were not just collections of parts following engineering specifications, but living systems that could be coaxed, optimized, and pushed beyond their rated limits if you understood their actual constraints versus their documented ones. The P-51D Mustangs arriving in England in mid-1944 were magnificent machines, but they faced a problem that was becoming increasingly apparent as German jet fighters entered service. The performance envelope of piston engines was reaching its physical limits. The Packard Merlin V16507 was already a masterpiece of engineering, producing 1,695 horsepower at takeoff with water methanol injection, capable of maintaining high power output up to 30,000 feet thanks to its two-stage, two-speed supercharger. But even this sophisticated power plant was simply outclassed by the laws of physics governing turbojet engines. The Me-262's Junkers Jumo 004 turbojets each produced 1,980 pounds of thrust, equivalent to approximately 1,500 horsepower at high altitude. More importantly, jet engines didn't lose power with altitude the way piston engines did. While the Merlin's output declined significantly above 30,000 feet, even with two-stage supercharging, the jets maintained consistent power output well into the stratosphere. The speed gap was fundamental and seemingly unbridgeable. Spagnuolo spent his first weeks at Bodney doing routine maintenance oil changes, spark plug replacements, magneto timing, the 1,000 small tasks that kept Mustangs flying. But he was also observing, thinking, and noticing things that bothered him. The fuel being delivered to the base was 100-octane aviation gasoline, a tremendous improvement over the 87-octane fuel of earlier in the war. Higher octane meant the fuel could withstand higher compression ratios and higher manifold pressures before detonating, allowing engines to produce more power. But Spagnuolo noticed something in the technical manuals that didn't make sense. The engines were capable of much higher compression ratios than they were running. The supercharger could deliver higher boost pressures than current settings allowed. The mechanical components, pistons, connecting rods, crankshaft, were overbuilt, stronger than necessary for current power outputs. The limitation wasn't mechanical, it was thermal. The engines were being held back by the temperature of the compressed air charge entering the cylinders. The hotter that air charge, the more likely detonation, uncontrolled explosive combustion that could destroy an engine in seconds. The water methanol injection system helped by cooling the charge, but it had limited capacity and couldn't be used continuously. What if, Spagnuolo wondered, You could cool the charge even more effectively. What if you could make the fuel itself act as a coolant while it burned? The answer came from an unlikely source. Aviation gasoline wasn't pure gasoline. It contained additives, primarily tetraethyl lead, which increased octane rating by preventing premature ignition. But Spagnuolo knew from his work in his father's garage that different additives could have different effects. Alcohol, for instance, had a much higher heat of vaporization than gasoline. When alcohol vaporized in an engine's intake system, it absorbed enormous amounts of heat, cooling the air charge significantly. The water methanol injection system already used this principle. The methanol component was methyl alcohol, and its evaporation cooled the supercharged air. But what if you added alcohol directly to the fuel? Not methanol, which was corrosive and toxic, but ethanol grain alcohol. It had similar cooling properties but was less corrosive and could actually burn as fuel, adding its energy to the combustion process rather than just acting as a coolant. Spagnuolo started small, cautiously. Using a 1-gallon can of pure ethanol, he'd traded medical supplies from a medic who'd liberated it from a German field hospital. He mixed a 5% blend with regular 100-octane aviation fuel. 5% ethanol, 95% gasoline. He poured this mixture into his personal Jeep's fuel tank and monitored the results for a week. The Jeep ran smoother, cooler, and seemed to have slightly more power. More importantly, it didn't explode, seize, or show any signs of damage. Encouraged, he increased the ratio to 10%, then 15%. Each time, the Jeep ran better. The temperature gauge showed lower readings. The engine would pull harder up hills. He was onto something, but proving it in a Jeep was one thing. Convincing anyone to try it in a $50,000 fighter aircraft with a pilot's life depending on it was entirely another matter. He approached his commanding officer, Captain James Dalglish, the engineering officer for the 487th Fighter Squadron. Spagnuolo laid out his theory by adding ethanol to the fuel. They could significantly cool the air charge temperature, allowing higher boost pressures and more aggressive timing without risk of detonation. This would translate to increased horsepower, particularly at high altitudes where every bit of power mattered. Dalglish listened politely, then told him no. Actually, what Dalglish said was more direct. "Sergeant, that's the stupidest goddamn thing I've heard this month, and I've heard a lot of stupid things. You want to put drinking alcohol in an aircraft engine? You want to modify the fuel supply of fighter aircraft in a combat zone without authorization, without testing, without approval from Wright Field or Packard or anyone who actually knows what the hell they're doing. Are you trying to kill our pilots?" The rejection was emphatic and, from a bureaucratic perspective, completely justified. The Army Air Forces had procedures for fuel specifications, testing protocols, and approval chains specifically to prevent well-meaning but dangerous modifications. Aircraft engines operated at the very edge of thermal and mechanical limits. Any change to fuel composition could have catastrophic consequences. Spagnuolo's proposal, from an official standpoint, was reckless at best, criminally negligent at worst. But Spagnuolo was also convinced he was right. The thermodynamics were sound. The chemistry was proven. Ethanol had been used in racing engines before the war, particularly in Indianapolis race cars, where cooling the charge was critical for extracting maximum power. The Germans themselves were using methanol injection in their fighter engines, though the Americans didn't know the details. The principle was solid. Only the application to aviation gasoline was novel. So Spagnuolo did what mechanics throughout military history have done when convinced they're right, and official channels say, no, he found a sympathetic pilot and made an unofficial test. First Lieutenant Robert Bob Elderwood was 23 years old, on his second combat tour, and had a reputation for pushing his aircraft hard. He'd also lost 2 wingmen to Me-262 attacks in the previous month, both shot down by jets that his Mustang couldn't catch. When Spagnuolo approached him in the crew quarters after a mission and explained his idea, Elderwood's response was immediate. "Can you have my bird ready tomorrow morning?" Sir, I should tell you this hasn't been tested. Engineering says it's dangerous. Could blow your engine. Sergeant, yesterday I watched a friend get cut in half by 30mm cannon fire from a jet I couldn't touch, couldn't even get close. If there's a chance your magic mixture gives me the speed to catch those bastards, I'll take that risk. Worst case, my engine blows and I bail out. That's still better odds than facing those jets with standard fuel. That night, working by flashlight in the darkness of the maintenance area to avoid attracting attention, Spagnuolo carefully mixed his formula: 15% ethanol, 85% 100-octane aviation gasoline. He'd calculated that 15% was optimal enough ethanol to provide significant charge cooling without diluting the fuel's energy. Content too much. He used a hand pump to drain the wing tanks of Elderwood's P-51D, the aircraft with the personal name Brooklyn Brawler painted on its nose, then carefully refilled them with his blend. He also made adjustments to the engine's fuel mixture controls, leaning it out slightly to compensate for the ethanol's different stoichiometric ratio. Pure gasoline required approximately 15 parts air to 1 part fuel for complete combustion. Ethanol required only 9 parts air to 1 part fuel. With 15% ethanol in the blend, the engine would run slightly rich unless adjusted. Too rich, and the engine would load up, run rough, and lose power. Too lean, and it would overheat and detonate. Getting it right required feel, experience, and luck. The next morning, October 1st, 1944, Elderwood's flight was assigned bomber escort duty, shepherding B-17 seconds to targets near Hamburg. Spagnuolo watched the takeoff with a mixture of pride and terror. If his calculations were wrong, if the mixture caused engine failure, he'd just killed a pilot and destroyed a fighter aircraft. He'd spend the rest of the war in Leavenworth military prison, if he was lucky. If Elderwood crashed on takeoff and burned, they might just shoot Spagnuolo outright. The Merlin engine coughed once, then settled into a steady roar. Elderwood advanced the throttle, and Brooklyn Brawler rolled forward, gathering speed down the metal matting runway. The tail came up, the wheels left the ground, and the Mustang climbed away into the grey English morning. Spagnuolo released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. 3 hours later, Brooklyn Brawler returned. Elderwood taxied to the hardstand, shut down the engine, and climbed out of the cockpit with an expression Spagnuolo couldn't read. The mechanic's heart sank. It hadn't worked. The engine had run rough, or the modification had caused problems, or Sergeant Spagnuolo, Elderwood said formally, and Spagnuolo braced for the reprimand. Then, Elderwood's face split into a huge grin. Whatever you put in my tanks, I need it in every aircraft in this squadron. That engine ran like it was possessed. At 25,000 feet, I was showing speeds 20 miles an hour higher than anything I've ever seen. Temperature gauges were lower than normal, and when I pushed it into war emergency power, the thing just kept accelerating. I've never felt anything like it. He hadn't encountered any Me-262 seconds on this mission, but the performance improvement was undeniable. His aircraft had been noticeably faster than the rest of his flight, able to keep up with the bombers while using less throttle, meaning better fuel economy. During a brief engagement with 190 seconds, he'd had a speed advantage that let him choose his engagement ranges. Most tellingly, his cylinder head temperatures had remained comfortably cool even at high power settings, suggesting Spagnuolo's theory about charge cooling was exactly correct. Word spread quickly through the squadron. Pilots started approaching Spagnuolo, asking if he could mix up some of that special sauce for their birds. He began mixing larger batches, filling multiple aircraft. Captain Dalglish, the engineering officer who'd called the idea stupid, noticed that several aircraft were performing unusually well. When he discovered what Spagnuolo had been doing, he was furious and also conflicted. "You went behind my back, Sergeant. You made unauthorized modifications to aircraft engines in a combat zone. You put pilots' lives at risk with untested procedures. I should court-martial you." Spagnuolo stood at attention, accepting the rebuke. But Dalglish wasn't finished. "However, every single pilot flying your modified fuel is reporting better performance. No engine failures, no problems. And yesterday, Lieutenant Elderwood engaged an Me-262 at high altitude and matched its speed long enough to score hits. Something that's supposed to be impossible." Dalglish paused, making a decision that could end his career. "I'm not going to court-martial you. I'm going to pretend I authorized this from the start. Keep mixing your brew. But if anyone asks, this was my idea, understand? I'm not letting a sergeant take the fall for something that's actually working. It was the beginning of an unauthorized, undocumented, and absolutely crucial modification that would spread across the 8th Air Force's fighter groups, giving American pilots the edge they desperately needed against Germany's jet fighters. But it was also the beginning of something larger, a fundamental shift in how aviation fuel would be understood, refined, and deployed for decades to come. The secret was in the chemistry, the thermodynamics, and one mechanic's refusal to accept that what worked in theory couldn't be made to work in practice. The science behind Spagnuolo's stupid fuel mixture was actually brilliant chemistry masquerading as backyard experimentation. To understand why adding ethanol to aviation gasoline produced such dramatic results, you need to understand the thermal constraints limiting piston engine performance at high-altitude constraints that the Me-262's jet engines didn't face. A piston engine's power output depends on how much fuel-air mixture can be crammed into the cylinders and burned efficiently. At sea level, atmospheric pressure is 14.7 pounds per square inch, and naturally aspirated engines can fill their cylinders with relatively dense air. But at 28,000 feet, atmospheric pressure drops to less than 5 pounds per square inches. The air is thin, containing far fewer oxygen molecules per cubic foot. Without some way to compress that thin air, engine power would drop to barely 30% of sea-level output, rendering high-altitude combat impossible. Superchargers solved this problem by mechanically compressing the intake air before it entered the cylinders. The P-51D's two-stage supercharger was particularly sophisticated. The first stage, driven by the engine's crankshaft through a gear train, compressed the incoming air to roughly twice atmospheric pressure. This compressed air then passed through an intercooler, a radiator that used outside air to cool the charge before entering the second-stage supercharger, which compressed it again to manifold pressures approaching 70 inches of mercury, nearly 3 times normal atmospheric pressure at altitude. This double compression allowed the Merlin engine to maintain sea-level power output up to 30,000 feet, a remarkable achievement. But compression generates heat. Squeeze air into a smaller volume and its temperature rises dramatically, following the ideal gas law, PV equals nRT. Double the pressure while holding volume constant, and temperature doubles. The supercharger's 2 stages didn't just double pressure, they increased it by factors approaching 3, meaning the air entering the engine could reach temperatures exceeding 300 degrees Fahrenheit before fuel was even injected. Hot air presents multiple problems. First, it's less dense than cool air, meaning fewer oxygen molecules per cubic inch, limiting how much fuel can be burned. Second, and more critically, hot air-fuel mixtures are prone to detonation, uncontrolled explosive combustion that occurs before the spark plug fires, creating shock waves that can shatter pistons, punch holes through cylinder heads, and destroy an engine in seconds. Octane rating measures a fuel's resistance to detonation. Higher octane fuels can withstand higher compression ratios and higher temperatures before detonating. The progression from 87 octane to 100 octane aviation fuel had been one of the war's crucial technological developments, enabling higher supercharger boost pressures and dramatically increased power outputs. But even 100 octane fuel had limits. Water methanol injection provided another increment of performance. When sprayed into the supercharged airstream, the water methanol mixture vaporized, absorbing enormous heat energy. The methanol component had a heat of vaporization of 1,100 British thermal units per pound, compared to about 150 British thermal units per pound for gasoline. This evaporative cooling could drop air charge temperatures by 100 degrees or more, allowing even higher manifold pressures without detonation. The P-51D's 30-gallon water methanol tank provided 5 minutes of war emergency power, increasing engine output to 1,720 horsepower. But Spagnuolo's insight went further. Water methanol injection was external to the fuel system, a separate tank, separate injection system, finite capacity. What if the fuel itself could provide charge cooling? What if you built the coolant directly into the energy source? Ethanol's heat of vaporization is approximately 360 British thermal units per pound, more than double that of gasoline. When blended into aviation fuel at 15% concentration, it provided continuous charge cooling every time fuel was injected into the intake system or cylinders. Unlike water methanol injection's 5-minute limitation, ethanol cooling was continuous as long as fuel remained in the tanks. The effect was cumulative. Cooler intake charges meant less tendency to detonate, which meant higher boost pressures could be used safely, which meant more power output. The mathematics were compelling. A 15% ethanol blend reduced air charge temperatures by approximately 40 degrees Fahrenheit at high boost settings. This seemingly modest reduction translated to a roughly 5% increase in air density, meaning 5% more oxygen available for combustion. More oxygen meant more fuel could be burned, which meant more power. The effect was most pronounced at high altitudes, where every degree of temperature and every fraction of a psi mattered. Additionally, ethanol's oxygen content provided another benefit. Pure gasoline is composed entirely of hydrocarbons, hydrogen, and carbon atoms arranged in chains. Ethanol, chemically C2H5OH, contains an oxygen atom as part of its molecular structure. This built-in oxygen meant slightly less air oxygen was needed for incomplete combustion, effectively leaning out the mixture without actually reducing fuel flow. The engine ran cooler, cleaner, and more efficiently. There were challenges, of course. Ethanol is hygroscopic, meaning it absorbs water from the atmosphere. In a fuel tank, this could lead to phase separation, the ethanol-water mixture, separating from the gasoline, settling to the bottom, and potentially being drawn into the engine. Spagnuolo solved this by adding the ethanol immediately before flight, giving minimal time for water absorption, and by ensuring tanks were kept as full as possible to reduce airspace where condensation could form. Ethanol also had lower energy content than gasoline, approximately 76,000 British thermal units per gallon, compared to gasoline's 115,000 British thermal units per gallon. At 15% concentration, the blend's overall energy content was reduced by about 5%, but this loss was more than offset by the increased efficiency from charge cooling and the ability to run higher boost pressures. The net result was increased power output despite slightly lower energy density. The chemical compatibility was also favorable. Unlike methanol, which could corrode aluminum and damage rubber seals, ethanol was relatively benign to aircraft fuel system materials. The rubber bladder fuel tanks, aluminum lines, and bronze fittings in the P-51D's fuel system tolerated ethanol exposure without degradation. This wasn't accidental. Spagnuolo had tested material samples in pure ethanol for weeks before mixing his first batch, ensuring no catastrophic failures would result. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By mid-October 1944, Spagnuolo was mixing 50-gallon batches of his ethanol-gasoline blend daily, supplying most of the 487th Fighter Squadron and starting to provide fuel to pilots in other squadrons who'd heard about the performance improvements. He maintained detailed logs of every aircraft using the mixture, tracking engine hours, performance reports, and any maintenance issues. The data was uniformly positive: increased speeds at all altitudes, cooler operating temperatures, no increase in mechanical failures, and several documented instances of successful Me-262 intercepts that would have been impossible with standard fuel. The breakthrough came on October 7th, when Major George Preddy, already an ace with 20 confirmed victories, used Spagnuolo's fuel mixture to achieve what should have been aerodynamically impossible. The engagement occurred at 28,000 feet, precisely where the Me-262's speed advantage was supposed to be insurmountable. Standard P-51D top speed at that altitude was approximately 420 miles per hour. The Me-262 could achieve 540 miles per hour, a 120 miles per hour's advantage that made engagement futile. But Preddy's Mustang, running on the ethanol-enhanced fuel and with aggressive use of water methanol injection, achieved speeds approaching 470 miles per hour in level flight. Multiple pilots witnessed the engagement, their testimony recorded in combat reports that would eventually make their way to Wright Field for analysis. Preddy had closed on a Me-262 inches level flight, matched its speed long enough to score killing hits, and forced the jet pilot to bail out. Physics said it was impossible. The wreckage on the ground said otherwise. The intelligence officers couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was happening in the 352nd Fighter Group that was producing measurable, repeatable performance improvements. When they investigated and discovered Spagnuolo's unauthorized fuel modifications, the initial response was predictable alarm. An enlisted mechanic was modifying aviation fuel without authorization, without testing, without approval from any official source. Regulations had been violated, procedures had been circumvented, careers were in jeopardy, but the results couldn't be dismissed. Combat effectiveness had increased, measurably. Me-262 intercepts, previously impossible, were becoming routine for pilots using the modified fuel. No increase in mechanical failures had occurred. The thermodynamic theory, when engineers finally examined it, was sound. Spagnuolo had stumbled onto, or, more accurately, had carefully reasoned his way to a genuine performance enhancement that the official research establishment had missed. The controversy reached Colonel John C. Meyer, commanding officer of the 352nd Fighter Group, and himself an ace with 24 confirmed victories. Meyer had to make a decision that could end his career or potentially save pilots' lives. Spagnuolo's mixture was unauthorized, untested by official channels, and violated every regulation regarding fuel specifications. But it also worked, demonstrably and repeatedly. Meyer made a command decision that demonstrated the flexibility that sometimes separated good commanders from dead by regulation ones. He ordered his engineering staff to formally test the mixture under controlled conditions, documenting performance improvements, monitoring for any adverse effects, and creating an official paper trail that would either validate or condemn Spagnuolo's work. The testing would take weeks. In the meantime, pilots who wanted to use the modified fuel could do so at their own discretion and risk. The tests were conducted by Captain Dalglish, the engineering officer who'd initially called Spagnuolo's idea stupid and who was now thoroughly converted to its validity. A P-51D was instrumented with additional temperature probes, pressure gauges, and calibrated airspeed indicators. Test flights compared performance using standard 100-octane fuel versus the 15% ethanol blend at various altitudes and power settings. The results were unambiguous. At 28,000 feet and war emergency power, the ethanol blend produced 4.7% increase in top speed, 22 miles per hour faster, 5 Fahrenheit reduction in cylinder head temperature, 40 Fahrenheit, reduction in intake manifold temperature, 8% improvement in time to climb to altitude, no change in fuel consumption rate at cruise power, no observable increase in engine wear or maintenance requirements. Most significantly, the cooler operating temperatures meant pilots could use war emergency power settings for longer periods without risking engine damage from overheating. Standard procedures limited war emergency power to 5 minutes. the capacity of the water-methanol injection system. With the ethanol blend's continuous cooling, pilots could sustain high-power settings for 10 to 15 minutes or more, limited only by mechanical stress rather than thermal constraints. The implications were profound. The fundamental limitation preventing piston fighters from competing with jets at high altitude wasn't mechanical or aerodynamic, it was thermal. Jet engines didn't face the same compression heating issues because they operated on entirely different thermodynamic cycles. But by addressing thermal constraints of piston engines through fuel chemistry rather than mechanical systems, Spagnuolo had partially closed the performance gap. Captain Dalglish's report to Colonel Meyer was emphatic. The ethanol-enhanced fuel provides significant performance improvements with no identified drawbacks. While unauthorized and unconventional, the modification is chemically sound and operationally valuable. Recommend immediate adoption across the group pending higher authority approval. Meyer forwarded the report up the chain of command with his endorsement, knowing it would create bureaucratic chaos. The response from 8th Air Force Headquarters was swift and conflicted. On one hand, they couldn't officially approve an unauthorized fuel modification that violated Army Air Force's specifications. On the other hand, they couldn't order a successful combat modification to be discontinued when it was saving pilots' lives and destroying enemy aircraft. The solution was typically military official disapproval combined with unofficial tolerance. The 8th Air Force issued a directive stating that aviation fuel specifications must be strictly followed and that unauthorized modifications were prohibited. However, the directive also noted that field commanders had discretion to make tactical decisions based on combat conditions. In other words, don't tell us you're doing it, but keep doing it if it works. By November 1944, Spagnuolo's ethanol blend had spread to multiple fighter groups across the 8th Air Force. Each group had its own Spagnuolo, a mechanically minded enlisted man or junior officer who understood the chemistry and could mix batches safely. The modified fuel became known by various unofficial names: Manhattan Mix, Spag's Special Sauce, Moonshine Blend, or simply the good stuff. Pilots would specifically request it before missions where Me-262 encounters were likely. The German jets remained faster in absolute terms, 540 miles per hour versus 470 miles per hour, was still a significant gap. But the psychological and tactical impact was immense. American pilots were no longer helpless against jets. With proper positioning, altitude advantage, and aggressive tactics, they could force engagements. The Me-262 seconds invulnerability was shattered, their speed advantage reduced from insurmountable to merely substantial. German pilots noticed. Intercepted radio communications revealed confusion about American fighter performance. Several reports mentioned Mustangs achieving impossible speeds at high altitude. One German pilot, captured after bailing out of his damaged Me-262, insisted during interrogation that the Americans must have developed a new fighter variant or engine modification because the speeds he'd observed exceeded published specifications for the P-51D. He was right about the engine modification. He was just wrong about who had authorized it and how it had been developed. It wasn't the result of a massive research program at Wright Field or corporate laboratories at Packard. It was one Brooklyn mechanic with an intuitive understanding of thermodynamics, access to ethanol, and the courage to violate regulations when he was certain he was right. The story should have ended with Spagnuolo receiving a medal and the Army Air Forces officially adopting his fuel blend. Instead, what happened was more complicated, more bureaucratic, and ultimately more revealing about how military innovation actually occurs versus how it's supposed to occur. December 1944, Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. The Army Air Forces Materiel Command's Fuel Research Laboratory was in an uproar. Reports from Europe described fighter pilots using unauthorized fuel mixtures containing ethanol, achieving performance improvements that seemed impossible according to existing engine specifications. The engineers at Wright Field were simultaneously impressed, horrified, and professionally insulted. Impressed because the reported performance gains were significant and, upon analysis, thermodynamically sound. Horrified because modifications to aviation fuel specifications in combat zones without testing could have catastrophic consequences. Professionally insulted because some sergeant mechanic in England had apparently discovered something that the best aeronautical engineers in America had missed. Lieutenant Colonel Paul H. Kemmer, Chief of the Fuels and Lubricants Division, assembled his team to investigate. Their task was to determine whether the reports from Europe were exaggerated combat stories or genuine performance improvements, whether the ethanol blends posed safety risks, and whether official fuel specifications should be modified. What they discovered would challenge assumptions about both piston engine performance and military procurement processes. The laboratory testing began with a Packard V16507 Merlin engine on a test stand, instrumented with dozens of sensors measuring temperatures, pressures, fuel flow, power, output, and exhaust composition. The engine was run through standardized test protocols using 100-octane aviation fuel, then repeated using fuel blended with 15% ethanol. The results confirmed the field report's power output increased, operating temperatures decreased, and no mechanical problems occurred. But the Wright Field engineers discovered something Spagnuolo hadn't known. The performance improvement wasn't just from charge cooling. The ethanol was also acting as an anti-knock agent, more effective than the tetraethyl lead compounds used to boost octane ratings. Ethanol's molecular structure disrupted the pre-ignition chain reactions that caused detonation, allowing even higher compression ratios than the charge cooling alone would enable. The combined effects produced performance improvements that exceeded the sum of their individual contributions, a synergy that multiplied effectiveness. Further testing revealed optimal blend ratios. Spagnuolo's 15% ethanol mixture was good, but not optimal. Testing showed that 20% ethanol provided maximum performance benefits while maintaining acceptable energy density and material compatibility. Above 20%, the reduced energy content began offsetting the performance gains. Below 10%, the cooling and anti-knock effects were insufficient to enable higher boost pressures. The sweet spot was between 18–22%, with 20% being ideal. The engineers also discovered why Spagnuolo's mixture worked better at high altitude. Ethanol's lower vapor pressure meant it vaporized more easily in the low-pressure environment at 28,000 feet, enhancing its cooling effect precisely where it was needed most. At low altitude, the cooling benefit was present but less dramatic. At high altitude, it was transformative. This altitude-dependent effectiveness made ethanol blends particularly valuable for bomber escort missions flown at 25,000 to 30,000 feet. Material compatibility testing confirmed Spagnuolo's empirical findings. Ethanol at 20% concentration didn't degrade rubber fuel bladders, aluminum tanks, or the bronze and steel components in fuel systems. Long-term exposure tests showed no accelerated corrosion, no seal degradation, and no compatibility issues. The mixture was as safe as conventional aviation fuel from a material standpoint. The phase separation issue, ethanol's tendency to absorb water and separate from gasoline, proved more complex. Laboratory testing showed that even small amounts of water contamination could cause the ethanol to separate out, potentially leading to engine failure if the separated mixture was ingested. The solution required careful fuel handling procedures, sealed storage tanks, and rapid turnover to minimize atmospheric moisture exposure. These procedures were feasible for military operations, but would be challenging for commercial aviation. By February 1945, Wright Field's testing had validated everything Spagnuolo had discovered empirically and added considerable additional understanding. The recommendation to the Army Air Forces was clear. Ethanol-enhanced aviation fuel should be approved for operational use, with formal specifications, production standards, and handling procedures. The performance benefits were real, significant, and came with acceptable risks if properly managed. but approving the modification officially meant admitting that an unauthorized field modification had been not only successful, but superior to officially developed specifications. It meant acknowledging that formal research and development processes had missed something important. It meant validating the initiative of someone who'd violated regulations and bypassed chain of command. The institutional response was complicated. General Carl Toohey Sparts, commanding general of the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, received Wright Field's report in March 1945. He also received reports from his fighter group commanders, documenting the tactical impact of ethanol-enhanced fuel. Me-262 kill rates had increased dramatically. Pilot confidence had improved. The jets were no longer invulnerable. Sparts made the pragmatic decision that combat effectiveness trumped procedural purity. In a directive dated the 15th of March 1945, Sparts authorized the operational use of ethanol-enhanced aviation fuel at 20% concentration for P-51 operations, with formal specifications to be developed by Wright Field. The fuel would be designated ANF48EE for ethanol, and would be produced at refineries in the United States, shipped to Europe in sealed containers, and handled according to strict procedures to prevent water contamination. Production would begin immediately to support the final air offensive against Germany. The directive carefully avoided mentioning Spagnuolo by name or acknowledging that the modification had been unauthorized. It presented the ethanol blend as the result of extensive engineering evaluation and combat testing, which was technically true, just not in the order those words implied. The impression given was that Wright Field had developed the mixture, tested it, and deployed it a narrative that preserved institutional dignity while adopting a successful innovation. Technical Sergeant Anthony Spagnuolo, the man who'd actually developed the mixture, who'd risked court-martial to prove his idea, who'd mixed the first batches by hand in the darkness of an English airfield, received no official recognition. He wasn't mentioned in the directive, wasn't awarded a medal, wasn't promoted. The Army's official history of aviation fuel development during World War II, published in 1946, doesn't mention him at all. The credit went to Wright Field's engineering teams for developing advanced fuel formulations that enhanced fighter performance in the crucial final months of the war. Colonel Meyer, who'd backed Spagnuolo when it mattered, was furious. He submitted paperwork recommending Spagnuolo for the Distinguished Service Medal, citing his contribution to the air war and the lives saved by improved fighter performance. The recommendation was denied with bureaucratic efficiency. The official response stated that fuel mixture modifications were within the normal scope of engineering duties and didn't constitute extraordinary achievement worthy of decoration. This wasn't just institutional pettiness, though there was certainly some of that. It reflected a deeper tension in military innovation. The official research and development process existed for good reasons to prevent dangerous modifications, ensure proper testing, maintain quality control, and protect pilots' lives. Spagnuolo had circumvented that process, and while his specific modification had worked, validating his approach could encourage others to bypass safety procedures with potentially fatal results. The military needed both rigid procedures to prevent chaos and flexibility to adopt battlefield innovations. Balancing these competing needs was never easy. In Spagnuolo's case, the balance was struck by adopting his innovation, while denying recognition, sending a message that the result was valued, even if the method wasn't approved. The first production batches of ANF48E ethanol-enhanced fuel arrived in Europe in April 1945, just as the war entered its final phase. P-51 groups transitioned to the new fuel, and pilots immediately reported the performance improvements that Spagnuolo's unauthorized batches had provided months earlier. Me-262 encounters, while still challenging, were no longer impossible intercepts. American fighters could compete at high altitude, and German jet pilots found themselves having to fight rather than simply attacking at will. The tactical impact was significant but difficult to quantify precisely. How many bomber crewmen lived because Me-262 seconds were deterred from attacks? How many German jets were destroyed that would have escaped if American fighters were 20 miles per hour slower? The answers are unknown, but combat reports suggest dozens of additional jet kills in April and May, 1,945, that wouldn't have occurred without the performance enhancement. The strategic impact was more subtle. Germany's jet fighter program, which had begun as a potential war-winning technological breakthrough, ended as an expensive failure that consumed resources without achieving air superiority. Multiple factors contributed: late development, production challenges, pilot training deficiencies, fuel shortages, and Allied bombing of manufacturing facilities. But American fighters' ability to compete with jets at high altitude was crucial. It meant jets couldn't operate with impunity, couldn't focus solely on bombers, and had to engage in energy-depleting dogfights with escorts. Major George Preddy, whose October 7th engagement had validated Spagnuolo's mixture, didn't survive to see the war's end. He was killed in a friendly fire incident on the 25th of December 1944, when American anti-aircraft gunners mistakenly shot down his P-51 during ground attack operations. He ended the war as the top P-51 ace with 26.83 confirmed victories, and several of his final victories against Me-262 seconds were achieved using ethanol-enhanced fuel. His combat reports, meticulously detailed, provided crucial data supporting the fuel modification's adoption. The story of ethanol-enhanced aviation fuel didn't end with Germany's surrender. Post-war testing continued, refining the mixture, optimizing procedures, and exploring applications beyond piston fighters. The Korean War saw renewed interest as American F-51 Mustangs, redesignated from P-51, faced Soviet-built jets. Ethanol blends provided marginal performance improvements, though by then the piston versus jet performance gap had widened beyond what fuel chemistry could bridge. The commercial aviation industry explored ethanol-enhanced fuels, but ultimately rejected them. The handling complexities, water sensitivity, and infrastructure requirements made ethanol impractical for civilian operations where safety margins were tighter and operational flexibility was critical. Commercial aviation stuck with pure hydrocarbon fuels, achieving performance improvements through better engine design rather than exotic fuel chemistry. But the automotive industry eventually adopted the principle, though for different reasons. Modern ethanol gasoline blends E10, E15, E85 are used primarily as octane boosters and renewable fuel sources rather than for charge cooling. The thermodynamic principles Spagnuolo exploited in 1944, evaporative cooling, oxygen-enhanced combustion, anti-knock properties, remain valid. Modern direct injection engines use these effects to achieve power outputs that would have seemed impossible with pure gasoline. The broader lesson of Spagnuolo's story concerns innovation in complex organizations. The official research and development process at Wright Field employed hundreds of engineers, had access to sophisticated testing equipment, and operated with multi-million-dollar budgets. Yet they missed something a sergeant mechanic discovered with basic chemistry knowledge and empirical testing. Why? The answer involves how organizations balance exploration versus exploitation. Large institutions excel at refining existing technologies, optimizing known processes, and scaling proven concepts, exploitation of current knowledge. They're less effective at exploring radical alternatives, testing unconventional ideas, and challenging fundamental assumptions. Innovation often comes from the edges of organizations, from people close to operational realities who see opportunities that bureaucratic processes miss. Spagnuolo succeeded because he was simultaneously inside and outside the system, inside enough to have access to aircraft, fuel, and operational feedback, outside enough to ignore regulations, saying his idea was impossible. He had the technical knowledge to understand what might work, the practical skills to test it safely, and the operational environment providing immediate feedback on results. The military's response initially rejecting the innovation, then slowly validating it, ultimately adopting it while minimizing credit to the originator, reflects institutional ambivalence about unsanctioned innovation. The modification worked and saved lives, which was good. But it bypassed safety procedures and violated regulations, which was bad. The resolution was to embrace the result while discouraging the method, a compromise that satisfied bureaucratic needs while capturing tactical value. Technical Sergeant Anthony Spagnuolo, mustered out of the Army Air Forces in October 1945, returning to Brooklyn and his father's automotive repair shop. He never spoke publicly about his role in developing ethanol-enhanced aviation fuel, partly because official recognition never came, and partly because he didn't seek fame. He'd solved a problem, helped pilots survive, and that was enough. He died in 1982 at age 67, his obituary mentioning his World War II service, but not his specific contributions to aviation fuel technology. The pilots who used his mixture, who chased Me-262 jets at 28,000 feet at speeds that shouldn't have been possible, who came home because their engines made enough power to compete with aircraft a generation more advanced, they knew what his work meant. After the war, veterans of the 352nd Fighter Group held reunions. Spagnuolo was invited and attended several. Pilots would buy him drinks, thank him quietly, tell stories about intercepts that succeeded because they had an extra 20 miles per hour when it mattered most. At one reunion in 1971, a former pilot stood up and proposed a toast. To Tony Spagnuolo, whose stupid idea turned out to be brilliant, and who proved that sometimes a sergeant mechanic knows more than all the engineers at Wright Field combined. The assembled pilots raised their glasses, and Spagnuolo, embarrassed by the attention, muttered something about just mixing some alcohol into gas and seeing what happened. But it wasn't just mixing alcohol into gas. It was understanding thermodynamics well enough to predict the result. It was having the courage to test an idea everyone said was dangerous. It was being willing to violate regulations when lives depended on being right. It was demonstrating that innovation often comes from unexpected places, from people who see problems clearly precisely because they're not constrained by institutional assumptions about what's possible. The Me-262 was a magnificent aircraft, a glimpse of the future, a technological leap that should have given Germany air superiority despite being outnumbered. It was defeated by many factors: late development, production problems, fuel shortages, pilot losses, strategic bombing. But among those factors was one Brooklyn mechanic's realization that cooling the intake charge with ethanol could give piston engines enough extra performance to compete with jets at high altitude. The Germans had the advanced technology. The Americans had Spagnuolo. And sometimes, ingenuity matters more than sophistication, especially when backed by industrial production capacity that could scale innovations rapidly. Within months of Wright Field's approval, American refineries were producing millions of gallons of ethanol-enhanced fuel monthly, supplying entire fighter groups with the modified mixture. Germany's jet programs, constrained by resource shortages and production difficulties, never achieved similar scale. The fundamental lesson extends beyond aviation and beyond World War II. Complex problems often have simple solutions that experts overlook because they're too simple, too obvious, too far outside standard procedures. Breakthrough innovations frequently come from people who don't know something is impossible and therefore try it anyway. And organizations that can rapidly adopt and scale field innovations, even when they violate procedures, often outperform organizations with superior technology but rigid processes. Technical Sergeant Anthony Spagnuolo's stupid fuel mixture was none of those things. It was chemistry, it was courage, and it was the kind of practical innovation that wins wars. The Me-262 jets were faster, more advanced, and more sophisticated than any Allied fighter, but American P-51s at 28,000 feet, running on Spagnuolo's ethanol blend, were fast enough. And in combat, fast enough beats theoretically superior every single time, especially when there are thousands of fast enough aircraft versus hundreds of theoretically superior ones. The divine wind of Japanese mythology couldn't overcome American industrial production. German technological sophistication couldn't overcome American operational flexibility and willingness to adopt battlefield innovations. In both cases, the lesson was the same. Wars are won not just by the best weapons, but by the best systems for identifying what works, scaling it rapidly, and overwhelming the enemy with practical effectiveness rather than theoretical superiority. One mechanic's experiment with ethanol and gasoline, conducted by flashlight in violation of regulations, proved more valuable than years of formal research. That's not an argument against formal research, it's an argument for creating space within organizations for maverick innovators who see possibilities others miss. Spagnuolo's mixture gave P-51 pilots the speed they needed to compete with jets. More broadly, his story gives us insight into how military innovation actually happens versus how we wish it happened, and why sometimes the best innovations come from the people closest to the problem rather than the experts furthest from reality.